Welcome. Hello. So good to see all of you. This is the highlight of my day, so thanks for spending some time with me. If you're just joining, we're going to give everybody a couple minutes to join, but thank you so much for joining us today for the second in the series of a webinar. Oh, I got all kinds of, I wonder if there'll be a time when it's all AI in here with me and not people, but just kidding. Yeah. Can't tell I just did a podcast on AI, right? All right. Let's see. Look at all these friendly names and faces. Well, not faces, but friendly names. Appreciate you being here. I'm just going to give it a minute. Okay. All right. So I am going to get started. This is recorded for anyone that is joining or will join us in a couple of minutes. But as you know, we put together a series of podcasts, wow, of webinars to talk about evaluating an agency if you're a buyer. So as you know, this is the second in the series. We had a last session which was about finding opportunities, getting organized, understanding your own agency first before you dive into thinking about other agencies. And today we're going to the next step. Let's say you found a great opportunity and you want to start thinking about how to evaluate that opportunity. So that's what today's going to be about. And then the next one in the series is about the deal. Once you've evaluated what kind of structures of deals exist, what are the things you need to think about as you structure those deals? All of these webinars are meant to get you thinking about this. If it's something you haven't had a ton of experience with, we want you to think about it and hopefully highlight some things that you haven't thought about before. And with all of this, you realize every situation is completely different, but we want to give you a strong enough overview that you feel like you're well prepared wherever you are in this process. So today's focus, we're going to talk about how to evaluate an agency once it's on your radar. We're going to talk about in the due diligence process while you're trying to either get yourself ready to make an offer, get yourself ready to evaluate it enough to even know if you want to make an offer, or you have made the offer and now you're going to dive very deep into the information to get to a deal that makes sense. What are some of the questions you should ask yourself before you get to that point? What are you looking for in the financials? I got to tell you, lots and lots of agencies reach out to us and say, they gave me all this stuff. What should I be looking for? I'm going to highlight what are those things that we would look for if we were doing it on behalf of you. What are the things you should look for, not just in the financials, but in a book of business, in the staff listing that they give to you, in the carrier reports that are provided, et cetera? What are those things you should be thinking about? We're going to highlight some of the common red flags that could derail the deal or potentially help you identify whether or not it's a fit or not a good fit for you. Because again, not every buyer is right for every seller, and not every seller is right for every buyer, but they might be red flags for you. And then what are those gut check moments that you need to ask yourself, and where you might want to say, hey, listen, this looked really great on paper. It looked really great in all the conversations we had. But I think at this point, maybe this is something we should walk away from. Um, Really hard to do. I will say there's a lot of people, especially if you're a first time buyer, you fall in love with the idea of doing a deal and maybe not necessarily with the deal itself. So I would love to highlight some of those. And then if we have time, I'd love to have a conversation. We can ask certain specific questions. I can't profess to have every answer to every situation, but I would love to get your feedback and talk about things that are on your mind as well. So let's go into the deal. What you want to know up front and ask yourself some questions like, first of all, The whole last webinar was about understanding yourself as a buyer. What are your own risks? What are things that you know about your book of business, your staff, your location, your concentration, to then determine, is something that I would be considering buying actually a fit for me? Does it exacerbate my weaknesses, or does it fill in the strengths where I am weak? So, number one, what's the fit between the two requires that you've looked at yourself in a pretty unique way. So that is first and foremost. And then as you're thinking about this, what is the size of the project you want to take on when you're looking at other agencies? Are they a super, super tight fit where it's easy? You have all the same carriers, you have the same culture, you've got the same approach, where it would be a really smooth transition. You operate the same way, you have electronic payments already in place, you don't have a lot of walk-ins, versus an agency that might not look exactly like you. So you have to be honest with the body of work that's going to come with a potential opportunity, and whether or not you have the capacity on your team to take on that body of work. It might be the hardest thing to estimate because it's not going to be a number on a page. It's going to be cultural items that you have to think through. And oftentimes, we think it's going to go way smoother because we both have the same AMS system and we think super simple, you just merge them. Well, it doesn't necessarily work that way if both agencies aren't using those systems in the same way. So again, really be honest with yourself about the capacity you have or someone in your agency who would be the lead on an acquisition. What is the body of work that you should expect that they would have, and are you ready for that? If you're already drowning in work, it may not be the time to put yet another body of work on top of it. Number two, are there carriers that you're trying to avoid or trying to obtain by doing an acquisition? A roughly 2 to 3 years ago, a strategy was find an agency that has the carrier appointments that you're looking for, and potentially you could buy that carrier appointment. I will tell you, if you heard someone doing that 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and it was a successful strategy, that strategy falls really flat in the middle of a hard market. So be careful if that's your strategy, and do your due diligence to make sure that those carriers will actually extend appointments. Even carriers that you're both appointed with, whether it's through a network agreement or directly, could choose during an acquisition to cancel contracts. So any kind of transition that you
Wait,
have
Rika,
going on, any kind of transition that you have going on, you need to make sure that you've asked, that you've identified that whether or not that is a possibility for them to extend that to you. Do you want to stay inside a niche or diversify? Like all of these things that you need to ask yourself, and then make sure you're being thoughtful about the opportunity that's in front of you. Is it putting me closer to that goal? Is it taking me further away from that goal? Are there synergies that you can create? And are you just trying to add short-term volume to your book of business, or is there a long-term strategy that this acquisition helps you with? All of those things will help you evaluate this opportunity in a different way than you may if you're not. So being really clear on your own goals, being really clear on what your strengths and weaknesses are, your team structure, your carrier structure, the way in which you do business will help you evaluate before you ever look at a piece of paper and you ever look at any of the financials. The 4 areas of risk that you should be paying attention to as you're assessing an opportunity: once you've decided culturally and strategically, this looks like it checks all of my boxes of the things that I want to do. And then you have to look at what are the risks inside the agency for me to then determine what's an appropriate deal structure and what's an appropriate price that I would place on this agency. So these are the 4 areas of risk that we actually evaluate pretty heavily in evaluation process. These are the factors that determine the multiple that is applied to someone's profitability. and they're in four different areas. They're their performance risk factors, their book health factors, concentration, and culture. So the performance is the agency growing? Is it profitable? What is its overall size? What's its retention rate? What's its loss ratio, et cetera? Some of those could also be turnover of their staff, et cetera. Their book health is what is the makeup of the book? How many policies per client? What's the account age, the producer age, the concentration that goes with any one producer? So you can look at who's driving that growth and will we expect it to continue? All of these risk factors are all about, is it predictable that the agency will continue to perform the way that it is? And concentration will tell you, or if one of these things change, can we expect it to impact the current performance or the current health of the agency? So if the owner changed, would it change who your referral partners are in those relationships? And therefore, the growth factor of new business would change significantly. If there was a producer change that didn't remain with the agency past the sale, could you expect the same growth rate? Or could you expect to lose a book of business because those relationships might follow, even though you have, an agreement in place? Could it create some risks? So the same thing with carrier. Could you expect that if you can't maintain a certain carrier appointment, might you lose a portion of the book? Or might you have to rewrite a portion of the book that creates potentially less revenue than what you originally looked at inside an agency? So each of these relate to each other, but also are factors that you need to consider and ask yourself, will it change the ongoing performance of the agency and to what degree? And in the next part of this series, how can we structure a deal to mitigate that risk in order so the buyer can command a price that's reasonable, the seller can actually make sure that the deal would cash flow? But all of these four risk factors are the things that you should be thinking about as you look at the information and have conversations with a potential, purchase opportunity. The culture piece is a lot of observing and a lot of asking open-ended questions to hear how the agency operates, whether or not the owner is super involved in the day-to-day, or do they have a team that is doing all of that? What are the sources of new business and what are the relationships driving those sources of new business? And will they change if some key players change? Is it paperless? Are you going to be able to glean all of the information about these client accounts, or is it all stuck in someone's head that might be walking out the door and going and sitting at a beach soon? So you got to really think about all of these different things, and each level could be at a different degree. And it could be that it's isolated only in some accounts that would be at risk. It could be someone's entire book based on their specialization. And it really runs the gamut. That nothing could be more diverse than the predictability based on the concentration with an agency. So I had a question here. It said, I recently saw that a local agency had sold. When I asked them about it, they told me they had a large client that wanted a name agency to reflect a larger presence. And this is why they sold. Anyone else hearing this from a large client? So I have many agencies that are small and say I had no business writing a particular client. Concentration by client is one of the number one risks that could change the deal structure in a transaction. Meaning, if you've got one account that makes up more than 5% of your total book of business, it becomes a risk factor. If that percentage is more like 20% of the book, it could be carved out and there could be a retention rate put on that account, because it's very likely that that account may not stay with the agency, especially if the agency doesn't have that level of expertise or doesn't write those size accounts, and it's an anomaly. There are oftentimes some agencies will sell one account because of that, de-risk their agency so they don't end up having a buyer de-risk everything because of that one outlier. So I don't know if I'm asking you a question, but I would say large accounts typically want larger agencies that have more resources, et cetera. So it becomes an even bigger, greater risk factor, especially if they're only there because of a relationship that's not going to continue into the future. Um, so last session we spoke about the stages of discovery and when you ask for which information. And I will tell you there are some agencies that are they sign the NDA and they're ready to send all of the information prior to an LOI. And there's some absolutely not. They want to give you very high level information, a couple conversations. They want to get under LOI and then share all of the information. I am of the opinion that you should get evaluation, which requires a high degree of information through this process. It also gives you a second set of eyes to be critical and thoughtful about this and take the emotion out of what you might be evaluating as a buyer. But this assumes we've gotten to the point where we have some information. We have financial statements. We've got a book of business, maybe with just the customer names taken out. We have carrier reports. We've got all of this information. And typically that is through the valuation and deal modeling, or you might have just your P&L at the financial preview. And this is assuming we've gotten to the point where we have a P&L. So let me just answer this question. Should we receive the LOI first prior to sending over the P&L, et cetera, to the potential buyer? Josh, that is a fantastic question. I would tell you if you want your LOI to be complete and have fewer changes between your letter of intent and your actual deal structure and offer, the more information you can provide up front, the better your buyer is going to be at really putting realistic structure into your LOI. So if you can give the information once they sign an NDA and you can give them your P&L and a scrubbed book of business, et cetera, you're going to have a much better outcome. Lots of deals fall apart between the LOI and the deal because there's too many changes, and that typically comes from not enough information to inform the LOI. In our current environment, though, with more buyers than sellers, there's a lot of people that try to rush to the LOI in order just to get that person off the market and talking to other people. Um, that is a really great question. But that rush to get the LOI can actually extend for that seller because if they get to someone and the due diligence is nowhere near, puts them in a position where the deal is nowhere near where the LOI was, it could actually be a start, stop, start, stop, start, stop, which would not be a good idea. So giving a complete package on the upfront will put you in a better position to keep that moving. What accounting reports are considered preliminary? So a preliminary, like if you went to a broker, they're going to tell you what the average size of the agency is, what the premium volume is, what the revenue is, what the 3-year growth rate is, what the 3-year profitability is, et cetera. They're going to do a summary of that agency, and they're going to provide you with probably 3 years of financials, a scrubbed all book of business report and some carrier reports are but the preliminary would be that summary and just those P&L statements. You probably won't get anything more than that until you move to make an offer, sign an LOI. We are going to go super, super deep on that information. So profit and loss statement, balance sheet, and typically 3 years of that could be done in the preliminary. Okay. Great questions. All right, so let's talk about evaluating the financials. Let's say we're in that preliminary and an agency has sent you their profit and loss statement. That shows their revenue, all their expenses, what the profitability is. Typically, they're going to make adjustments because they're going to want to highlight that this agency can spit off a ton of profit because that's the number that we then multiply in order to get the value of the agency. So there could be a P&L statement with a whole bunch of adjustments for you to consider as the buyer. Number one, when you're looking at a financial statement that an agency owner sends to you, not all revenue is created equal. So that predictability of the revenue becomes very important. So you have to know what's included in each of those revenue numbers. For instance, I have an agency that is testing the market right now, and this agency includes a very, very small bond book. It also includes life insurance policies, as well as he has a pretty healthy contingency. If that agency had all of that listed as revenue and you couldn't tell in their revenue what's contingency, what's bond, and what's life, those three things, it is not guaranteed that those are continuing and they don't have the same retention structure as total commission and fees. You could actually make an offer and the person selling life is the owner, therefore that whole revenue stream goes away. If you could put too much weight on their contingency and pay a multiple that ends up taking a big chunk of your revenue out. The same thing with bonds. So please, number one, know what's in the revenue and ask a lot of questions. When we start with a CFO client and they have their contingencies folded into their total commission and fees, one of the first things we do is pull it out so we can see their actual growth rate. The second is if they've done acquisitions, it could show a growth rate that you don't know is actually not organic growth. It might be one or two spikes of small books they've purchased. And the retention on that purchase book could be different than the retention on their overall agency. So definitely know what is included in that. Um, so someone, because I said the word contingencies, most people ask a lot about how much to include with contingencies, but I'm going to read you the question. It says, do you see the contingency bonuses being considered in the total revenue when people make multiple offers? We actually separate our contingencies by carrier in our P&L. So contingencies are included as revenue that is, that is included in the P&L, but not all of the contingencies you have. Typically, large buyers will suggest a 4-year average of contingencies as long as nothing has changed with the carriers. I love that you're saying that you pull it out by carrier because if you have a carrier that's made contingency changes, like in order to be eligible, you now have to hit a different category than you did before, or that is now under a network category. So now your percentage is different than what it's been historically. You can actually support those changes and make a case for why something should be included more or less than another. But you should ask, what is your trend by carrier and what does that look like, and use the 4-year trend. Yeah. So that's revenue. You got to think about all of the behavior of the revenue and whether or not there's any acquisitions. Make sure those contingents are separated out. The last thing about revenue is lots of agencies have miscellaneous income. And if you don't know, it can skew the information. So for instance, had an agency in Texas that had a great investment portfolio. They had interest income that was consistent over all 5 years when we valued them. They were not leaving their cash with the agency. So that interest income was going to go away. And if you don't know that, you could be counting on something that isn't there. If they sold an asset and it's in miscellaneous income, remove it completely. It's not going to happen again. Or there is miscellaneous income that will recur, such as if they use premium finance and they get a fees off of that. So if it's something that will continue with the operation of the agency, make sure that you know what it is, and that those things that are going to recur, leave it there. If you can't justify that it will recur into the future, take it off because it'll actually skew your offer. Now let's talk about some expenses. Compensation is your largest expense on a P&L always, and knowing whether or not your compensation is accurate, reflective of the current staff. If you're looking at 2024 year-end financials, we're in August of 2025. That's going to be what the compensation was in 2024. You might have hired 3 more people. You might have only had a partial year of those people in that year. You also might have had terminations during that time. You need to get a current list of what your staff costs are and make sure it's annualized so you can tell what that is. That's a big surprise when people don't know what they're looking at. Owner compensation, you can't just remove all owner compensation, especially if that person's going to stay on in some capacity over a period of time. It needs to be accounted for. You also as the buyer, want to make money on this agency. So you are going to have to pay yourself or pay somebody to manage this agency as well. So it's not just a take it to zero. It's more of a make a reasonable assumption of what's going to be needed, either absorbed by your staff or someone you would have to hire in order to replace anybody that would be exiting. So owner compensation and just compensation in general, you have to go further than the P&L. If you just trust what's on the P&L, you're going to miss things. Discretionary expenses, that's where people typically write a whole series of things they're going to remove from the agency because either you can cover it by your agency or combining your books, etc., or it's their things that they're running through the agency that have nothing to do with selling insurance. So I would just be very mindful of how detailed it is and ask yourself, will making these changes change leads, the ability to market, the ability to continue to grow the way the agency has grown, and have a conversation about them. If this agency has made contributions to local organizations on a regular basis for the last 20 years and writes all of those local organizations and those contributions stop, you got to ask yourself, is that going to impact me negatively as the future owner of this agency? They're not all equal. Some are just, you know, they're making it's a country club, subscription. That obviously isn't going to change your ability to continue to operate this agency. So it's not all equal. You got to go deep on those and make sure it's not impacting the future performance of the agency. Last but not least, you want to look at the trend in an agency's financials. What have they done over time in the same category, and why did it change? What were those things that mattered? Because it could tell you a story about the agency. And if it is not clean and it's not, if they're all over the place and they're done differently every single year, it could change what those revenue trends are. It can also do the same thing in your expense trends. So you've got to really think about how solid are these financial statements and how much weight can I put on them, and 100% go beyond just the statement to get clarity. So a financial statement shows your revenue, your contingencies, etc. So does the book of business, and so does your carrier reports. And if you get carrier reports where the revenue total amount doesn't match your P&L, something is off, and you need to reconcile that and make sure you know what the total revenue truly is for this agency. So remember, that's just one part, but you absolutely have to be thoughtful in what these numbers are telling you, and are they accurate and complete? Some of the performance can come off of these financial statements as well. So you've calculated what the growth rate is, you've asked the question if there's any acquisitions. You now know this agency is typically growing at a 10% growth rate, let's say. Now you need to ask yourself, is it sustainable? Where is the growth coming from? And is there anything that would prevent it from continuing to happen? Meaning, if an agency says their growth rate comes from their community involvement, and the only person involved in the community is the owner, and that owner has been the lead of this agency for 40 plus years. Nobody else goes to the chamber, nobody else goes and volunteers or sits on boards, and that person is no longer part of your agency. It is reasonable to think that you may not have the same leads occurring in the same way. On the other hand, if you have an agency that has an unbelievable online presence, they write content, they have leads that come from current client referrals, they also have a whole group of people that are part of community where it's multiple. They also have referral sources. They've got multiple ways that they're driving new business to the agency, less risk, more confidence that that will continue to operate in that way. So you've got to look at concentration. Is the profitability consistent and reasonable with the assumptions that the person has put in front of you? Or were they completely varied many times over time? And what caused those peaks and valleys in that profitability of the agency over time? That story, having someone explain that to you, can tell you an awful lot about the agency. It could be they lost a carrier appointment, had to roll a book, whatever, had, moved a lot of their E&S business to, admitted carriers. There could be a lot of like volume of work that could have changed the performance of this agency over time that you need to be aware of, especially if you're buying an agency in a market you're not familiar with or a niche you're not familiar with. You need to ask if there's variations, what caused the variations. If an agency is of a size that you would be able to absorb into your own capacity, putting a side by side together of their financials, your financials, what you could eliminate, what hiring you really would need, puts you in as at an advantage as a buyer because you can have some strategic synergies that others may not. If you're the same size, you have no capacity on your team, you would have to replace or staff for the transition unless you want your performance to also be impacted during this transition period. So it really does matter what the makeup of the buyer is, what their capacity is, and what those synergies are. And you need, to be able to assess that on a pretty significant basis to make an offer that makes the most sense. Knowing the retention of an agency is so key, but it is the number that most agencies cannot report effectively or accurately. And I mean revenue retention, customer retention, policy retention, and premium retention. And it's really difficult. The agency management systems are not set up to do this in a really thoughtful way. That's one challenge. The second challenge is if your processes are not tight across an agency and there's inconsistent reporting, these numbers can get skewed very, very easily. So knowing what that retention is and what the predictability is, like what are the lost accounts and are there other accounts like that you could expect would also be lost is really important. And getting your arms around that. So if you're on this call and you're an agency that is potentially going to sell in the future, everyone's going to sell in the future. That's the spoiler alert. Having tight retention numbers puts you in a position of strength. It's also the thing that you want to, if there's a question around it, that is when you see deals that have a component of cash up front and some payments based on the retention of the book, if this is uncertain in any way. And then loss ratio is definitely something you need to make sure that you can pay attention to and make sure that this potential acquisition does not hurt your performance or your contingency performance eligibility with any carriers because their losses or their practice of what they write could actually impact a strength inside your agency. Really important to think that through. So there's a statement here that says once managed an agency that had a single relationship that represented 60% of the agency revenue. Scared me, but the owners were good friends with the owner. I reminded them that the owner was approaching 70 and his industry was changing, and I did not see him wanting to make changes there when needed. This is really important point. I'm going to stop. If you are buying an agency that the owner is in their 70s, chances are the clients that they have are a reflection of them or one decade before or after them. So I'm 52. My clients would either be 50 in their 60s or their 40s. That's typically how that looks. If someone's in their 80s, that means that they have not a lot ahead of them. They're 80s or 70s. The likelihood that the transition of those clients' ownership might change and during that change go somewhere else is higher than someone that has a book of business that's managed by multiple producers in multiple age groups. And that means that the whole book is not in flux. It's just part of the book in flux. So sorry, but you reminded me of that. And I had an agency that was looking to sell in Texas, and 70% of their staff was at or beyond retirement age. That agency on paper, if you didn't look at anything else, their revenue was great, they were growing, they were super profitable, but 70% of their staff was going to transition and probably at the time of sale because none of them wanted to go through transition. That changed the value of that agency significantly. So anyway, in his story, 3 years later, the client owner sold, retired, and the agency lost 40% of their revenue nearly overnight. They retained the property portion as that was not sold. You can see the account was obtained as the agency owner got lazy and stopped participating in the local community groups. It's really important. Relationship in a relationship business is not a joke, and you've got to be able to quantify it. And that's part of the how do we structure around that to minimize that risk. So, okay, so we talked about financial risk factors, performance risk factors, common mistakes when evaluating financials. Number one, thinking all revenues created equal. It's probably the number one mistake. Not making these adjustments or knowing that, of that revenue number, 100,000 of it is life insurance. It's fantastic. And if the person that sells life is staying with you, potentially you can give credit for they've consistently done life sales for a period of time, sure. But if the person who does the life sales is the owner and they're walking away, you just lost that revenue, period. It's not coming back. That bond or that, anything that's not recurring. So please, Lord, don't think it's all created equal. Trusting the P&L at face value, like saying, this looks great, and not digging in and understanding what some of these expenses are or what the adjustments to the expenses are is a big, mistake when you look back on it and you said, I should have dug in deeper and understood what that meant. Or having someone underestimate the expenses and you find that operating this agency requires more expenses than what you originally thought because they underestimated them or took them out. Assuming growth equals health. So we are in the middle of a hard market. Growth could be just rate, and it could mean that the potentially this agency is losing customers, but still growing on the P&L from a revenue standpoint. And when the market softens, all of a sudden you have less revenue and less customers than the average person, and it no longer cash flows. So you got to understand what's happening with the lost business, lost accounts, and what we think that trajectory is going to look like, and not be masked by rate. Overlooking the owner adjustments, I think we've hit that one pretty hard. And then not reconciling with carrier reports, taking this revenue is the revenue and not looking at the book of business and making sure that that ties so you can actually see which accounts make up this revenue. And also they write it with this carrier. These carrier reports actually tie to this revenue amount. If you do not do that adjustment, you're probably leaving money on the table. And the reality is, we all talk about how data's dirty, but we don't go through this process. And therefore, we write a deal and buy something. And once it moves over, we realize it wasn't there. So, not reconciling to carrier reports is a problem inside agencies in and of itself, but certainly in a transaction, you've got to reconcile to those. So let's talk about some concentration factors. I think I hit a couple of these, but I want to highlight some metrics so you know. If you're looking at a book of business report, when we value an agency, we take your book of business report, we get it in an Excel or CSV file, and we look at areas of concentration in multiple areas. So we look by your top client, by your carrier, by your producer, by line of business, by niche. And we want to make sure that if any one of those things changes, what's that risk factor? So your concentration with any given carrier should not be more than 25% of the total book. This is really tricky in a book of business report when carriers are merging, they use different names, etc. You got to make sure that you get clean data to know what this level of exposure is. And then more than 25% of a book. I've been valuing agencies for several years now. And when I first started in a soft market, people would laugh at this and say, that's ridiculous. I don't know what you're talking about. This carrier is super good. We do that to maximize our contingencies, et cetera, et cetera. I agree with all of that. But if that one carrier changes your commission rate from 12.5% to 9%, you're going to know really quickly why having more than 25% of your book with one carrier is a risk factor. I'm not saying it's a risk factor you can, mitigate completely, but that is a concern because if you're super heavy concentrated with one and they make changes, they change their appetite, etc. Actually, the hard market made my point in this area, but when it was a soft market, people would balk at that. Having one client that's more than 5% of the book, that's when we start to worry. Or your top 10 clients are more than 40% of the book, even sometimes 30% of the book with a group of clients that are all related in a niche. So each of these risk factors compound if it's all with one carrier, all with one producer, all in a niche, all that requires that one person's expertise. You can see how the risk gets higher and higher and higher if the relationship goes with a volume of the book. A niche that could disappear within a market change or a loss of employees' expertise or relationships, I should put there, and a key producer owning too much client loyalty or referral partner loyalty can create risk factors. So, some of the things to keep in mind: number one, do I have a true picture of the carrier concentration? Do I also have a true picture of the carrier or of the client relationship when I run a book of business report? Do I know that Carrie Wallace, while her personal is here, she also owns four businesses that are all connected? So, really, five of those will leave if Carrie Wallace leaves. Do I have a good understanding of what that is in an agency that I'm evaluating? Ask those questions. What are the things that they think are most at risk, and what is the plan for those accounts to stay? And the more information you can get, the better off. And agencies that have clean data, they want to demonstrate this because they can show the strength of their agency. Dirty data that does not reveal the true risk is the biggest challenge in this area. And you could underestimate the risk and find yourself in the situation that Michael just highlighted, where a portion of the book walks away because of a relationship, or a portion of the book really was more at risk because of the demographic of those clients and how they're connected with the agency. So, too much in one line of business is obviously a risk factor. Lack of new business or lack of predictability of the new business going forward, not understanding why it's coming to the agency and how it's being driven. Policies per customer is a metric that you should know, and you should know it in personal lines and commercial lines, and the percentage of monoline accounts. The reason for this is the more accounts, the more policies you have with the customer, the higher the likelihood of that retention rate staying high. And there are different metrics for commercial lines and personal lines because obviously the coverage for those are different. So, knowing what your policy per customer is in a niche, in commercial lines, personal lines, and your number of monoline accounts can actually help isolate what your retention rates are and the predictability of your retention rates, and really put you in a position of strength. Same way we were talking about contingencies by carrier, you can start to look at segments of the book as stronger than the others and not do a one size fits all. So that policy per customer is really important. If you're preparing for a sale, it's one of the areas you should focus on in order to account round and position yourself to get maximum value for your book as well. I have a hard time not flipping between you're a buyer, you're a seller, because at some point this asset is really, really valuable and you want to maximize it. Your high touch clients that require hand holding, identifying those and making sure that the agency has multiple people involved in those accounts, that's way less risk than one that the producer is the only face inside that account and that producer is not going to stay, or they're past retirement age, etc. The culture and expectations of customers, really important. Finding out from an agency that you're going to purchase, how do you engage with your customers? How often do they hear from you? What are those engagements? Do you do a review every year? What's the review look like? Having them step you through their customer journey so you make sure either you're elevating the customer journey or you understand that these people walk in with cash, sit there and talk for 30 minutes with the staff, different purchase. So you really need to understand what that engagement looks like and make sure that it fits. That could be a deal breaker right out of the gate, and you didn't have to look at a paper or evaluate a financial piece of paper because that just wouldn't fit with your agency, and it would actually derail what you've got going on inside your own agency. So cultural risk factors, number one, I haven't talked about it yet, but producer-owned books are some of the number one ways that can put brakes on a deal, and ambiguity about who owns the book, how much book is owned by whom. The worst thing in that situation is no contract and no document and a handshake. It becomes you have to document it and you have to understand it, or you can't sell what you don't own. So, number like ask that question and get that clarified. If you're a potential seller on this call, you want to get that tight as tight can be prior to ever engaging in selling your agency because it'll slow it down pretty quickly. Over reliance on one person, often the seller, but it could be the operations person. It could be whatever inside an agency can cause eyebrows to rise that, again, the ongoing performance of the agency could be impacted without that person present. They could have carrier relationships. They could have referral partner relationships. They could just be the cultural leader of that team. And therefore, that team might not stay if that person's not there. So know what that dynamic is and what that reliance is and try to mitigate it as much as possible, or try to incent that person to stay and provide continuity inside the agency to minimize the impact of their exit over a period of time and give them time to transfer that knowledge or relationship to you as the potential buyer. The staff demographics and expertise. I ask in every valuation what the hire date is of every person that's on staff and also the birth year of that person to put a demographics together to say this is the level of expertise, the number of years experience they have at the agency. If they want to give us experience that they have in the industry, even better. But also, this is their birth year, and are they near retirement, or which decade are they in, and what's the generational health of that agency. We then can get the book of business and see this producer works with this account manager, therefore they're both going to retire at the same time, or maybe the producer is at retirement age, but all the account managers are in their 30s and they have the relationship, less risky. So knowing the demographics, expertise, and the teams that work together can actually mitigate some of that client risk that you might identify initially. Um, an agency that has no documentations or procedures could create some serious risk as you take over those accounts. Having a 5-year tail is an absolute, should be in every LOI because the number of E&O claims that are filed typically fall like 90 some percent of them fall within the 5 years after a sale. So making sure that you cover yourself there. And it should be just a term that's there that the seller has to put in place a 5-year tail for anything, for any structure. Old school tools or mindset. You might have the same exact tools or same exact systems, but you use it in a very different way. So don't assume because they have Hawksoft and you have Hawksoft that Hawksoft is equal. That may not be the case. This is also an area when we value agencies, it's one of the areas we spend the most time on is comp structure. If your comp structure and the agency you're purchasing's comp structure is vastly different and you want to blend these cultures together and that person wants to command a price that is commensurate with what they think is happening in the industry, that comp structure can prevent some serious synergies between when you're trying to put these agencies together. So if I pay 45-30 for my producers and everybody is validated, and this other agency pays $100,000 base for all of them and there's no commission structure, going to be really different mentality, going to be a really different way to do that. So that's a solvable problem, but it has to be done over time and make sure that everybody in that is going to face a change understands what that change is. There's ways around it by offering some, some incentive pay to people that stay, et cetera. But it's a thing you have to start early in order to figure out that comp structure. The other the other part of it is if I offer benefits and I'm buying an agency that doesn't offer benefits, it could be very well an add back that I'm going to have to put their staff on my benefits in order to blend those two organizations. So don't be surprised if there's add backs to variances in overall compensation or benefits that are offered. So things to think about, but you can't imagine having an agency where you're not offering the same across the board. So things that can go wrong. The deal structure does not match the risk factors. You have an agency that expects to get paid everything up front, and they've got one account that makes up 30% of their total book, and they do not want you to carve it out, and you cannot pay that agency, and they've heard everybody gets 3 times revenue. So I want 3 times revenue up front. I want you to include all my contingencies and that large account that is completely at risk. Not reasonable. That is a bad situation. I guess I should put up here just going off of what you heard everyone else has done might be the biggest mistake. It is not a one size fits all. So basing your deals on others, not an expert's advice or the risk factors that you've evaluated, is probably one of the biggest mistakes you can make. It is the number one reason why internal transitions are renegotiated, because the seller has a price in mind because of what he's heard other people say. There aren't any experts involved. A bank's not involved to do a reality check. You might not have gotten evaluation, and therefore you come 3 years later and say, this doesn't cash flow. I can't grow the agency and command the performance to continue to pay you. We have to renegotiate it. That is very, very common. That happens in internal transitions that don't follow the right structure. Retention is overestimated or unknown, and therefore you underestimated the lost business that is going to occur in a transition. The carrier appointments don't transfer, and you didn't do your due diligence to reach out to the carriers during that between the LOI and the deal, and you didn't get confirmation that you can obtain those carrier appointments. And now you have a portion of the book that's a book roll in the middle of a hard market. Could be a problem, and that could definitely change your revenue and the body of work that you are facing. Cultural differences between the staff were completely underestimated. Super sad, but that is one that is pretty significant. Or the data conversion fails from legacy systems, and now you've got a body of work that you didn't expect. The network membership don't transfer. Someone who's part of a network cluster or alliance, and it creates some retention issues, or you find yourself competing to keep a portion of the book, is not good. So not all network agreements are created equal. Understand the agreements and the risks that come with that, and do your due diligence. That's a piece in the contract that you must figure out what that contract says and what they're able to do and what risk you have as a buyer. Basically, all of these things mean whatever deal you put in place, it doesn't cash flow because we didn't put the right assumptions in place, and we over offered because we underestimated some of those things. So the things that go wrong is at the end of the day, you're doing all this work and the profit that's left over isn't working out, or it just doesn't cash flow, and it becomes a bad deal. If a deal is only good for one side and it's not a win-win-win for everyone, a win for the buyer, a win for the seller, and a win for the agency, it's a bad deal. So if you're feeling like, man, I got the best deal ever, it's not a good deal because something's going to go south as we're going, through year 2, year 3, year 4, and vice versa. So that is probably the biggest things that I would say. Your gut check and deal killers. Sometimes it's not what's in the documents, it's what your gut tells you. I am a data-driven person. I think you can tell, like I like the the information, but really you've got to know, does this feel like a fit? And use the data to check your gut and then some. So you got to make sure that you're not just falling in love with the deal and not asking or listening to the things that really are what's most important to you and are going to move your agency forward. Misalignment in goals, values, and communication is probably the number one thing. You heard what you wanted to hear, or you didn't ask the question, or they told you what you wanted to hear, and therefore you get now you're married to each other, and unfortunately, it's not a good situation. There's no path to integration of the two organizations. Therefore, the synergies that you thought you were going to have by eliminating tech, eliminating a location, eliminating, potential overlap in accounting work, et cetera, drag on for a period of time, and therefore the profitability is not there. And there's too many unknowns or trust me responses in the situation. I'd probably back away. The number one thing is, if you can't get clarity in the information and it changes every time you ask for it, I would mitigate my risk by lowering my offer or putting a retention clause in place that's going to manage that risk factor um, in that situation. It's important to say, like, there could be things that raise an eyebrow. You're definitely getting a lot of information about a person you're just getting to know, or maybe have known for a while, but not known to this degree. So not every red flag is a deal breaker. You've got to define that for yourself, but it could be a deal shaper. And you definitely need to make sure that if your gut is telling you something's off, think about the structure of the deal, which is the next topic in our series, and make sure that you create something that mitigates that risk and creates that win-win. So this was, I'm glad you guys spent time with me. I can't believe I'm actually doing it in an hour. These are challenging for me because I could talk forever about this topic. But I hope you join us on session 3, where we talk about structuring the deal, the terms, the talent, transition plans, maybe comp structures that go along with that earnout for the key people. Like, all of those topics are what we're going to talk about next time. Thank you so much for joining me. And I look forward to seeing you on September 10th at 1. If anybody has questions about things that we talked about, I'm happy to hang out and answer a couple of those for you. You are welcome. Appreciate everybody that put some comments in here too. Oh, thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. All right.